sopar del xef Joan Roca. Dit això, sí que passem del testimoni del senyor Joan Soler al món de la imatge, amb la senyora Yael Hersonski. Ella ens presenta la conferència que porta per títol El rodet desaparegut i la realitat absent. Graduada amb honors des del 2007 a l'Escola de Cinema i Televisió Sam Spiegel, ha estat directora i editora autònoma, a més d'editora de continguts, en un programa documental al Canal 10 de la televisió israeliana, amb el que va obtenir el premi al millor programa documental de televisió 2004 de l'Acadèmia Israeliana. Actualment és editora de documentals i programes dramàtics per la televisió israeliana. La seva primera pel·lícula documental porta per títol Una pel·lícula inacabada. Precisament, a més, en el marc d'aquest Congrés d'Arxius i Indústries Culturals es presentaran dues cintes en direcció de la senyora Yael Hersonski. Porten per títol Gueto i són un testimoni real de la vida als guetos jueus. Podran veure aquestes projeccions el proper dimecres 15 d'octubre a 7:15 del vespre a la Casa de Cultura de Girona. Ben segur, però, que la senyora Hersonski ens podrà donar testimoni d'aquestes gravacions i del seu treball realitzat fins ara. Té la paraula la senyora Yael Hersonski.
Hello. First, I'd like to thank the Council of Girona and especially Mr. Boades for inviting me. It's a great honor and a real pleasure to be here at the Archive Conference. I think that if the Holocaust taught us something unique about the potential of knowledge, it is one that relates to the role of the archive in modern culture and politics. I focused on the archive as home of power and was trying to question the underlying assumption about the validity of the documents in the archive, real or imagined. My relation to the archive is not only as a form of representation, but I think as a concept of operation. I think it makes sense to begin with a very personal story, which explains why have I dealt with such a harsh archival footage, like that Nazi propaganda film that was made in May 1942 inside the Warsaw Ghetto, and it is indeed the longest film that survived and was produced by the Nazis about that ghetto. There are some bits and pieces from other years, but this one is evidently the most impressive and insightful for me. Well, first of all, I visited for the first time in my life the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Israel, Yad Vashem, when I was maybe 29 years old, which is a very, it's very rare to reach such an age and not having been at that museum. It's part of our heritage. Between the ages of maybe 13 till 18, I hardly know anyone who hasn't visited that national site. And the reason why I excluded myself from all the tours to that museum, most of them were organized by our primary schools and high schools, was that my own personal witness, let's say, my own personal survivor from the Holocaust was my grandmother, and she preferred not to talk about her memories, about her trauma from her time inside the Warsaw Ghetto and then in Auschwitz. And there were other very difficult times in other places. And her decision not to talk was, the other side of that decision was her decision to live. For her, trying to verbalize what is almost inconceivable was taking a chance of not surviving. Her survival was dependent on her silence. And the way the state of Israel, in a way, nationalized this historical period in a way that it narrativized it into its own purposes, it was something that always disturbed me, and I rather exclude myself from the national social gathering around this Holocaust ritual. For me, my grandmother's silence was, let's say, in a way, the ideal archive. It archived things that I couldn't talk about, but were even more real than images that I've seen or documents that I've read. When she died, I was already a film student, and I must say that Shoah by Claude Lanzmann was something that I couldn't imagine any filmmaker for me, disabled the ability of any filmmaker to say something additional about what was already been said in that film. A film that, as its director said many times, was against all archive. He radically refused to use any cinematic footage, mainly because of the identity of its documenter. I mean, most of the footage from that time was documented by the Nazis, and for Lanzmann, using that kind of footage was like seeing that time through the Nazi viewfinder or through the Nazi lens, giving a place to the Nazi's point of view. This is something that he was trying to prevent from, to something that he tried to avoid. For me, that was, and still is, a masterpiece, but when my grandmother died, I started to think about the role of the witness and about a time when no witnesses will be left, and the only thing that we will have in our hands will be the archives. And as a filmmaker, the cinematic footage was my main interest. But before I started to look for the right material to explore, I remembered that there was a time when my grandmother spoke, and it was one day in her life when she immigrated to Israel. Someone from that Memorial Holocaust Museum came to her house to collect her testimony. She asked from her family members to be left alone with that person. The legend says that she told everything that she remembered. It was archived, and no one talked about it again, ever again, as long as she lived. 1 month after she died, I remember that there is this black box inside Yad Vashem archive, and without even thinking about it, I rushed to the museum, straight into the archive, and asked for my grandmother's testimony. I mean, the whole inversion of her silence was supposed to be there. And soon enough, they found the testimony. It was in Polish, on very thin, almost transparent paper, because it was taken maybe 50 years ago. And without even understanding Polish, later it was translated for me, I immediately understood that there was nothing there. My grandmother described her very technically, in a very dry way of describing the stations that she went through. I started here, I went to there. She said one sentence about the Warsaw Ghetto, that on her experience from the Warsaw Ghetto, she was not willing to say anything. And that was very interesting for me, because in Israel, maybe the key word when one talks about the Holocaust is Auschwitz. Auschwitz is the total notion of the horror, of the atrocity. But here, my grandmother, who was in Auschwitz, the most difficult part for her was to talk about the Warsaw Ghetto. And the one who typed her testimony writes there, I sense that the witness is having trouble to speak, and I didn't want to bother her. I didn't ask her any more questions. And that's a document inside an archive, which documents almost nothing. I think that this experience brought me to reflect upon the holes of the archives, the lacunas, the spaces of void inside an archive, which I think that it's even sometimes more telling than what exists inside an archive, what doesn't exist. And I started to look for another kind of material which is archived, not the paper document, but the cinematic document, which is for me unique in the sense of its openness. There's something in the cinematic image that doesn't exist, not in reports, not in letters, not in diaries, not in any form of written testimony. And I think it finds its expression in the gap between the intention of a cameraman to document something specific and what the camera itself documents. I think I can find it maybe in every frame of the film that I was researching. There was something the cameramen were trying to show. Sometimes they even directed scenes in order to tell a specific story. In the case of my film, the very crude version of that story would be that the Jews are annihilating their own community because their lack of morality, the way they run, they run the community. There are rich people who are taking from the poor ones, and this is the reason why so many people are dying in hunger and diseases. So this is a story that the Nazi film crew was trying to construct for probably a propaganda film. But in the same time, they were documenting so many other layers of reality that they could not control. For example, if one is trying to document the way commerce was going on inside the ghetto, what they were trying to show is how Jews are constantly occupied with money and with deals, and how to earn on the expense of the other. In the same scene that was very carefully documented, directed actually, with extras and sometimes costumes, and meat that was brought into a market to show that there's lots of food inside the ghetto, and it's only a matter of how you split the commodity. In the same time, you can see faces, you can see expressions of people looking into the camera and expressing something which was utterly exceeding the Nazi narrative. I think that the moments in which people are looking straight to the camera and expressing their own existence, even if the scene is directed by a director and there are a couple of cameramen who are designing and establishing angles of photography, even inside that film set, people could still express their own anxiety, their own fears, sometimes just by looking, and sometimes by writing about that in diaries. What I started to do is, first of all, I approached a film producer and told her about my idea to try and explore a film footage from that time, and I was looking to find something from the Warsaw Ghetto because of my personal connection to that place. My grandmother was born in that city, and she suggested me to go and look and have a look at the 60 minutes unfinished propaganda Nazi reel. And the first reaction when I saw that footage was mainly a shock. And I think that the shock was immediately it was from the images themselves, which were very difficult to watch, but it was also because of the gap between what I knew from that film and what was the film and what the film actually was. Just to give you a brief example, I don't know how many of you have seen the film, so it's kind of challenging to describe scenes from the Nazi propaganda film, but there is one scene which documents women descending into a ritual bath. Now, when the film was was made, the women were surrounded by men, uniformed men, who were pointing cameras at them, and some of them were pointing even guns. They were forced to undress and descend together into the ritual bath. They knew, these women knew that if they will refuse to do so, to go inside the bath naked in front of these men's eyes, probably they will be executed. In the frame, you can't see any evidence to the fact that the women were surrounded by threatening men. All you can see is just the women descending. Their expressions are expressions of agonizing, of great suffering. When I was visiting a museum, a Holocaust museum in Warsaw, a very small Holocaust museum, this scene was exhibited repeatedly on one of the exhibition screens, and below the screen was written, "Ritual life inside the Warsaw Ghetto." It was very odd because that scene was documenting anything but ritual life inside the ghetto. First of all, descending into a ritual bath is not something that one does in a form of a group. It's something that you do alone. But beside that, this scene, if you research and learn something about what happened outside the frame, is about torturing. It's not about women descending into ritual, and the way the propaganda film was inverted into a real documentation of life inside the Warsaw Ghetto by so many filmmakers and even museums is something to wonder about. I guess that because so many film material were destroyed during and after the war, and the world was left with a limited amount of archival footage, it was maybe more important to visualize that time than to be accurate about the context of in which these images were created. For me, to explore the context and to understand the operation of the archive itself, what is archived, what is not archived, what is being used and what is remained to be hidden, how you use a footage inside a film, in a museum, a still frame in a research book. I think the way professionals and non-professionals uses the footage, the documents, are the understanding of their use is much more important than telling stories using this footage as merely as illustrations. This is, I think, the use that was, this is how it was used. I call it misused in Israel for many, many years. The main role of the witness belonged, and this is something that is very, it makes sense that the witness, the Holocaust survivor, was at the head of the hierarchy of witness. I mean, there was nothing more sacred than the testimony of a Holocaust survivor. And when Holocaust survivors were talking, footage was playing just to illustrate what they were saying. But that footage is another reflection of reality. There's a present time that is frozen inside these film reels. For me, it's like a time capsule that one should be very sensitive and aware of the way he uses this kind of material. Also because every time we use documents, every time we use footage, we tell a story, and the story is always being told from a certain perspective. I was trying to open my perspective into a kind of a Rashomon, which will enable the viewer to understand the problems and the limitations of every witness, every document, even a film document, in relation to the reality it was documenting. Here there is a very strange story about a propaganda film that was never finished. No one knows why. It was saved in the form of a rough cut, of a very open version of what the filmmakers wanted it maybe to be. There is another story about this footage which tells us that the Nazis were trying to archive certain documentations of how they saw reality for the sake of future generations. I always wondered why did they make such a film in 1942 after the failure of the first propaganda Nazi film, the most famous one, The Eternal Jew, which was made in 1940. It didn't hold even 1 week in cinema theaters because the audience was so appalled and so shocked by the images from the Warsaw Ghetto and the Łódź Ghetto that they just left the cinema theater, and after 7 days or so, the film was removed from the screens. 2 years later, they're making a kind of a more sophisticated version of that film, and I always wondered why should they do another attempt to show something that even the audience couldn't digest. And then I found a document inside the Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, who was writing just before the film was, the shooting of the film finished. He wrote that now when the Nazi regime decided to move the Jews to the east, it's very important to make as much films as possible about the Jewish communities and their way of life for the sake of future Third Reich generations, to educate them about that poor race of the Jews and how they used to live and endanger other communities. So this propaganda film was not meant to be seen at that time, but was meant to be saved for years to come. But it was found in '54 in East Germany with no soundtrack, just a mute version of one of the editing results of the rushes, And what I was trying to do is to create a new soundtrack for that film, because I think that if the film had a soundtrack, it would have been just a complete piece of propaganda with no possibility to enable us to see the context and how it was made. But since it was a rough cut, and one could see how other Nazi filmmakers are incidentally entering the frame, or the lighting set inside a home where children are dying, or the footprints of the director, the way scenes were documented. The way scenes were directed, the way people were told to go left or right. If we hadn't have that version, I think there was nothing to work with. But since I had that, I started to look for as many testimonies as possible in order to allow me to understand the way this footage was created, and thus to understand what is the real testimonial value of a film footage, of a historical film footage. I was not trying to tell the story of the Warsaw Ghetto. I was trying to tell how a story about the Warsaw Ghetto is being told. How do we watch, or how do we see, or what do we see when we look at film footage like that? How do we interpret it? From which narratives do we make the first step toward the film footage? What is the context, the historical context in which we are watching this footage now? I did several things. First of all, I was looking for Holocaust survivors from the Warsaw Ghetto, but only those who were willing to tell me something about that film crew that was shooting inside the ghetto. Now, that was for me, before even trying to find those witnesses, it looked like an impossible mission. And I remember that even in our, again, Holocaust Memorial Museum, Yad Vashem, they told me, forget it, everyone died. There are only few survivors from the Warsaw Ghetto who are still alive. It's not possible. And actually what made it possible is a very interesting detail. Most of the people who are still alive today were children at that time of the Warsaw Ghetto. And it seems that only children could actually register, recall such a non-important event inside a ghetto, like a film crew shooting a propaganda film. The adults were much more occupied in surviving, in worrying about the future. When I asked my grandmother, for example, or someone like Marcel Reich-Ranitzky, the very famous literary critic in Germany, about their recollections regarding that film crew, they couldn't remember anything. But the children who are today, or maybe over 80 years old, the children notice this very surreal event, and some of them even remembered in a very detailed way the way the film director directed a scene in the street, the way another cameraman was hitting a woman in order to establish a certain frame of panic. And I found 5 of them. Actually, it's not true. I found 8 witnesses who could remember, but before I invited them to a cinema theater to see the footage in 35 millimeters, I asked them if they are certain that they will, that emotionally they can survive such an experience. Those who hesitated, I asked them not to come. I knew that maybe I will lose something for the film, but I couldn't take the responsibility of someone so fragile like them not being able to watch it while it's running. The only 5 that came to the cinema theater were not only willing to watch a footage which includes sometimes unwatchable scenes, they insisted on watching it because, as they said, for them it was a relief to have the chance to say the last word over these images. Because 8 years ago they were on the side who had to be silent, and now they can watch what was documented from the other side and respond. So that was one layer of testimonies about the filmmaking. Another layer was documents that we found in an archive in Germany, in Ludwigsburg, another Bundesarchiv. We found there 2 things. One was the testimony of one of the cameramen who documented, who were part of the film crew inside the Warsaw Ghetto. That testimony, I think, was familiar to the German the German archivist in Berlin, but what was not familiar was the fact that that we decided to locate the cameraman family and ask for his own pictures. What I was told in the Film Bundesarchiv was that somewhere at the beginning of the 90s, they were trying to locate this cameraman and sent all the families called by the same name, Wist, in Germany, letters trying to identify that specific man, and all of them replied that they don't know this man. Probably time passed, the man has died, and his sons felt that they are free maybe from the shadow of their father, and were willing to give us photographs of the cameraman, one of the cameramen who were documenting the Warsaw Ghetto. And when we had that man's photo, we could identify him in a very interesting moment when one of the cameramen are entering the frame. We could identify that this is the cameraman whose testimony we use. The name was Willy Wist. He had entering passport into the ghetto, and that passport was found in another archive in Warsaw by a German historian during the 60s. In Ludwigsburg, I found the documentation of an interrogation that took place in 1969 against the one who was running the Warsaw Ghetto at the time of the shooting, and became after the war a German lawyer. The Germans decided to prosecute this lawyer because of his crimes during his time in the Warsaw Ghetto, and were looking for all the people who could tell them something about the Warsaw Commander crimes. They heard about Willy Wist, the cameraman, and invited him to a preliminary interrogation. Willy Wist, as a simple cameraman, of course, could tell nothing about the commissar, but instead he talked about the way he documented the Warsaw Ghetto. And there I had this wonderful interview with a cameraman telling from his point of view what was he thinking about what he was documenting. And I think that this testimony is probably the most, for me, important testimony in the film, because at least as I saw it as maybe a younger person, footage from that time of the Holocaust always looked like pieces of pure history. It's like no one has ever filmed that. It was as if history was created its own visual documentation. I never thought about that history is something that was documented by a very simple cameraman lying to himself regarding what he's documenting, probably not telling the whole truth about what he remembers from that time. But there was something very human, maybe in a negative sense, about that documentation that became after the war something like objective document from the Warsaw Ghetto. I think that my film invert this objectivity and shows or tries to show the human aspect in the sense of its faults and question marks and ethical problems. I think that it inverts that objectivity into something completely else. There's something very relative about that footage, and it depends on the way we interpret the frame and on our knowledge about what went on outside the frame and affected the frame itself. There is another testimony in the film which is of the commissary himself, which testifies about the film crew. There is one scene when he tells that he brought the film crew into a Jewish prison inside the Warsaw Ghetto, and prisoners fainted because they saw these uniformed men with cameras, and they thought that this was the moment of their execution. It's an ironic moment in his reports where the camera is being perceived by the Jews themselves as weapon. And another very interesting aspect of the testimonies is the Ringblom archive, which is almost a postmodern archive, if you can use that term when talking about the 40s of the previous century. Ringblom was an historian who felt that a scholarly documentation, scholarly writing about that time wouldn't be adequate to in relation to the size of the catastrophe, and he believed that he should give everyone who is willing to write a chance to document his own daily life, because he knew that this will be the last chapter of that very rich community. And he established a huge and very unique archive, which was kind of the private history of whoever was willing to write. And I think that one of the interesting things that one can detect from the film is the way the Nazis were documenting and the way the Jews were documenting. I mean, the Nazis were documenting with all the film most modern technology. The Jews were writing in a kind of subliminal, esoteric way, and I think that when we're talking about that piece of footage from '42, we cannot ignore the vast archival inventory that encircle this footage and enable us to really understand its frames. Just to conclude, or maybe as a last story, there was a very interesting exhibition in Paris in 2000. I think it was the year 2000, which was a great source of inspiration for me when I was making the film. And the exhibition was exposing for the first time a few frames that were documented, that were very familiar photos from the Holocaust, documenting a pile of bodies who were about to be burned in Auschwitz. People are taking care of the technical things that had to be done. And in 2000, someone managed to expose the real frame of those photos. And what was so fascinating about that was that the real frame was exposing another frame, and it was the frame of a window. And when examining that frame of a window, one could understand that the frame of the window was the frame of a window of a gas chamber. Gradually, it was understood that the photos were taken by members of Sonderkommandos. Sonderkommandos were Jewish prisoners whose job was to clean the gas chamber and then take care of the bodies. And there were some individuals who were brave enough to smuggle a camera on their body, and when no one noticed, to take it out for a single moment to document that pile of corpse and to bring it back again to the place of hide. Then they succeeded to smuggle it outside the ghetto. When the one who developed the film saw the images, he thought that the frame of the window was not important. Thus, he cropped the above and the below. He cropped the left side and the right, and concentrate on the main image, what was shown from the window. But actually, I think that the most crucial frame is full frame. When you see someone who was risking his life in order to document, who was risking his life for the sake of public knowledge, who was seeking his life for the sake of future generations. That what was the window frame was showing, and I think that for me, understanding the archive, understanding its operation is probably the most fascinating thing filmmaker for me can do. Thank you. I hope it was made any sense. Thank you for listening.